To me, more revelations keep coming out is that period between the cancellation of the show and Star Trek the Motion Picture. It's just the more you dig, the more you find, just from whether it's the conventions or the aborted movies or Phase 2 or whatever it may be, it's just such a rich period of watching something go from the ashes to rising.
We're spoiled today because we have so much science fiction available to us, so many movies, so many thousands of hours of television. But what we have to keep in mind is that Star Trek in the 1960s was doing all sorts of things for the first time. It had 2 pilots. That had never happened before. It was a continuing set of characters in science fiction. We had Twilight Zone back then. We had Outer Limits. There was Lost in Space, but that was more of a family fantasy show than science fiction. That's
and
what
the
it
ones
became.
for adults seemed to be more, they were more like anthologies.
Yeah, anthology stories. And so Gene Roddenberry was trying something new.
The first week we got a bag of mail. Second week we got 2 or 3 bags of mail. And after that it really started pouring in. The studio couldn't handle it. We certainly couldn't handle it. We had to have B. Joe and John Trimble, the separate contractors, to handle the fan mail for us because it was coming in and coming in and coming in. And it was amazing. And I don't know that NBC ever quite understood how big an audience we really did have. The Nielsen's were only in certain homes. If you didn't have a Nielsen box on your TV set, they didn't know what you were watching. The mail should have told people, yes, this is a great show. It's attracting a lot of viewers. They just weren't being counted.
We always had the feeling this could be the last show, and at any minute NBC could pull the plug. So I think there was an underlying sense of, well, let's just do the best job we can for ourselves, which is why some of the scripts were so ambitious. Let's just go full out.
NBC canceled Star Trek in 1969. And they tried to cancel it in 68 after the second year. And it's been reported that they received over 1 million letters.
On the second season, it was Deadly Years was the one we were watching being filmed. People would come down and they'd sit in their chairs and they were just, it was very down. So we went over to the craft services table and asked the person in charge, and he says, oh yeah, the word's come down, the show's going to be canceled at the end of the season.
It's just strictly
It's not
unofficial.
official
Nobody
yet,
knows about
but
it
he
yet,
says,
but
"We know
they
it."
know about it.
And I said, it was really sad. There ought to be something we could do about that.
When word got out that Star Trek was going to be canceled after 2 seasons, they hadn't counted on, first of all, the number of science fiction fans who just loved the show. And the Trimbles started this write-in campaign to save Star Trek.
I did my homework. I went around to talk to secretaries, not only in the movie business, but all over. What kind of letter makes you just toss it? What kind of letter makes you put it in the, nut file? What kind of letter do you answer, and what kind of letter do you put across your boss's desk?
D-Jo had done something brilliant. She had said, don't put Star Trek on the envelope. Just address it to NBC. That means somebody has to open it up. But that let them know that there was an audience, and I think that was a key factor in keeping Trek on the air.
A lot of these were petitions with hundreds of signatures on them as well.
I had an NBC person tell me, well, we only got 50,000 letters. And I said, that makes us even stronger. If we can get things done with 50,000 letters instead of the 1 million, I'm fine with that.
John and B-Jo arranged a demonstration at NBC.
People were picketing NBC. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of people outside with picket signs. And that was the first inkling that you weren't the only crazy one, that there were other crazy people out there. You discover that there is this community of fans out there. And I started my own Save Star Trek campaign on Long Island, where I grew up. The show was saved. You felt like you had something to do with that. NBC made an on-air announcement that Star Trek will be returning next year, basically saying, stop.
So the network had to renew the show.
When you're a 13, 14-year-old kid and you hear that, you go, wow, we wrestled the network to the mat.
And they put it in the death slot, Friday nights from 10 to 11, figuring it would die. The first episode, Spock's Brain, won its time slot, killed the competition, including the 2-hour premiere of Hawaii Five-0, which went for 12 years. So the show was still doing good, but the network had to get rid of it because of the taboos and the deteriorating relationship with Gene Roddenberry.
After NBC canceled the show, their demographics department came back and said, we found the perfect show for reaching the 18 to 35 male demographic. He says, oh, great, what is it? It's called Star Trek, you have it. Oh my God, we just canceled it.
The syndication market started to take off regionally in different segments of the country, probably in, well, even as late as 69 as the show was coming to an end, but then into 1970.
I Love Lucy and the Honeymooners were about all there had been syndicated, aside from game shows and talk shows. A guy named Dick Block at Kaiser Stations made a deal to syndicate Star Trek. He saw the potential of Star Trek as a great ratings getter, a money maker, for local stations.
I was a fan in syndication. I was one of the guys at school who would go meet with my fellow Star Trek fans. There was like 3 of us in our high school. We were so obsessed that we would actually record the episodes on cassette tape and bring them, the cassette players, to school and replay just the audio to listen to the episode. That's how crazy we were about the series.
I watched all 79 episodes over and over and over. So the local station in Detroit played them, and they were stripped Monday through Friday, I think 3 o'clock.
These little stations, their ratings are going through the roof.
They'd go through all 79, and they'd start again. And I would watch them again, every one of them.
It came a point where you'd seen these episodes so many times, and you wanted more than the hope, the prayer, the dream that Star Trek would one day come back in some fashion. The history of the resurrection of Star Trek is checkered, but it also goes back much further than most people realize. Even when the series was in production, Gene Roddenberry was talking about at conventions wanting to do a Star Trek movie.
In 1968, the World Science Fiction Convention was held in Oakland, California. Gene came up to speak, and when he was talking about Star Trek, that is, in our research, the first time he said that he was talking to Paramount about a movie that would take place in the Starfleet Academy and show how Kirk, Spock, and McCoy first met. So that's 1968.
And took them on to their first mission.
In 1971, NBC tried to bring it back to prime time.
And they went to Paramount. They asked to repilot the show. And Roddenberry said, "We have 79 pilots. You don't need another."
And Paramount said, we're making too much money off the reruns. And they felt back then that if we have it on in prime time, it'll kill the reruns. We know that's not true now. And Paramount said, no, we can't give it to you. And NBC, give it to us in some form. NBC tried to get a 2-hour movie for TV from Paramount.
And the idea was to do a low-budget movie and for a couple $1 million in 1973. Gene Roddenberry was going to reunite with Herb Solow, who had been the executive at Desilu at the time, who was now at MGM, to do a movie called The Cattleman, an idea based on an original pitch that Roddenberry had for the original series called A Question of Cannibalism. And in this script, or in this treatment that he had, the idea was about sentient cow-like beings that were being bred and slaughtered by, ranchers in the future. And it was an allegory for the fact that we eat meat, we eat cows, we eat animals, and this was going to be very much hitting it on the head. The whole thing ended up very acrimonious between him and Herb Solow. They never talked again. The Cattleman, mercifully, was never put into production.
So the news gets out, again, in our newspaper or fanzine club newsletter pace. No internet, no 24/7 social media.
I've always believed that conventions, fan conventions, were the original social network. Long before digital social networks existed, fan conventions were a place where all of us fans that were passionate about a subject matter could gather together, make new friends, celebrate our love of the subject matter together.
What had happened is Star Trek fans were showing up at the World Science Fiction Convention and were being treated as well, you're not real science fiction fans. Star Trek is a TV show. 72, I think it was, 72, a group of fans in New York decided to create their own Star Trek convention. It was just an incredibly good group of people.
The older science fiction fans, even the ones who liked Star Trek, felt a little crowded by all of the young women who suddenly wanted to be in fandom because they loved Star Trek. And they said, why don't you like any of the other science fiction? I don't only want to talk about Star Trek. And so at the conventions, we sometimes felt a little snubbed. So we contacted our friends. I have a friend in Boston. I'll call her and say, we're doing a convention. And she'll call not only all the people in Boston, but her friend in Michigan. And so it just went out of, crazy. We did advance registration. We had 800 people sign up in advance, and we thought, wow.
I expected a good turnout. I didn't expect what actually happened, which was an enormous turnout, far more than expected. I think we thought maybe there'd be 500 people, and I think there were a couple of thousand.
We ended up with something like 3,400, and it's a really good thing the fire marshals never found out, because that floor in the old, I think it was the Statler Hilton then, it was never designed for 3,400 people. We don't really know exactly how many people there were, because the last day we were just saying, oh, just write your name down on this index card and throw it in the box. And somebody stole the box. But we ran out of everything.
I was glad to feel that that love from the audience, that we're still behind you, we still like you, we're still good. It was a boost, it was nice. And I think that might have been one of the things that pushed Gene Roddenberry in 1973 to go to the Star Trek animated series.
It's just fascinating when you stop and watch the growing of the conventions and how the animated series sprang because of the success of the conventions in a lot of ways, which leads to all these attempts to make a movie.
Fans didn't have an outlet other than these conventions to express their desire for more Star Trek.
It was amazing. The overflowing of affection and goodwill. The actors came. We didn't pay them. They came.
They were in it for the fun of Star Trek and for hanging out with the Star Trek cast. And we had such a good time, and they were so generous. They took such good care of us.
And they were writing their own fan fiction and doing their own thing to keep it alive, at least amongst themselves.
We just kept on doing it. It was like machinery. We'd take a week off after the convention, and then we'd start to plan the next one. I think Gene was very flattered that we all loved his show so much. It gave us great pleasure and great joy. We met a lot of wonderful people, but mostly it was just what we did for love.
I was probably about 11 by this point, 11 or 12, and my mom comes rushing into my room at night and wakes me up out of a sound sleep. They had been watching the evening news, and they'd seen a little, upcoming segment. She's like, you've got to come see this. I don't know what this is. She drags me out of bed into their room, and they're doing a little, fluff piece on a Star Trek convention that was going on in New York. I had no idea this existed. I mean, it was crazy. And my mother literally turns to me and goes, look, it's people like you. And I was like, whoa, there are people like me, which made my parents feel a little bit better, I think, that it was not just some kind of complete psychotic problem I was having.
Star Trek had created this incredible hunger for science fiction. So Carrie O'Quinn created Starlog magazine. And Starlog magazine reported on science fiction news, mostly TV and movies.
I had learned that there were fan clubs. Star Trek fan clubs. They mimeographed little newsletters and mailed them to each other. And when we actually went to our distributor and said we want to do a science fiction magazine, he said, you know, you're crazy, because he said there's a couple of hundred people that get together at a hotel wearing pointed ears once a year. He said that's not enough to support a national monthly newsstand magazine. And they basically said no to us to begin with. But I knew there was a soul to this show. It had a vision of a better tomorrow that was Gene Roddenberry's optimistic view of human nature. And I said, this has staying power.
I kept waiting for this whole phenomenon to die away. You know, it's like, you know, I didn't think there was going to be a phenomenon, and when there was, I said, well, how long can it last?
Back in those days, science fiction didn't win awards. It wasn't taken seriously, but I knew there was enough people there that I wanted to give them something that would feed their interest and keep that passion alive, because I knew it was a positive passion.
You started getting rumors, maybe they're going to bring Star Trek back, series and all this, and of course this was all fed from Starlog, and those were like treasures to me.
The hunger for Star Trek continued. There was attempts to, once again, do Star Trek as a low-budget movie. And one of the first concepts for a Star Trek feature was called The God Thing.
Gene started writing The God Thing as a treatment for a film. It was rejected by the studio.
It's about an alien vessel that's coming back to Earth that claims to be God. It went through several different iterations. Eventually, there would be plans to novelize it, and it went through several different people. Michael Jan Friedman was going to do it.
I looked at the script, and I was what can I say? I think it would be legitimate to say I was horrified. It had all kinds of problems. The characters, they were doing things that they just really wouldn't do. Kirk has a scene with these 3 naked siren-type entities. There's no reason for it. There's no story reason for it to be there. Kirk talks to a bird at one point, and finally, the pièce de résistance, Kirk dukes it out on the bridge of the Enterprise with Jesus Christ.
This computer is malfunctioning and taking the form of different biblical figures. And I think there is actually a scene where Captain Kirk battles Jesus on the bridge of the Enterprise. So this was not something that was getting greenlit.
The essence of the God thing was that all of our religious icons had been manifestations of a particular alien entity. And the entity was coming back now to claim its rightful place in our star-spanning society. The God thing was very heavy-handed. I just couldn't make it something that the fans deserved. So I decided to distance myself from it.
The Michael Jan Friedman version came the closest, but the thing about the God thing that makes it less unique is so much of the DNA of the God thing is in subsequent Star Treks. It not only bears a striking resemblance to Star Trek the Motion Picture, but Star Trek V as well. The God thing didn't happen. Gene started to collaborate with a writer named John Povil, who ended up becoming an associate producer on Star Trek the Motion Picture. They had a script that they had developed which involved a black hole. That didn't happen. That was passed on by the studio.
Back and forth, you would hear the rumors. So here's Gene has a movie idea. The script does not go. You hear these weird ideas that Paramount still wants to do a Star Trek, and they're having science fiction writers come in and pitch.
At that point, it became a pitch-a-thon, and they started going to like anyone who'd ever had a sci-fi credit to develop a pitch that they liked. John D.F. Black came in, also with a black hole pitch. Black holes were very big in the 70s. It's no wonder Disney made the black hole. Everybody was in the black holes.
It was always frustrating for Gene. He would come up with ideas and they would shoot them down. This long slog through the halls of the higher-ups trying to get something done. Then the studio would say, no, we don't like that, try something else. And, that has to be terribly frustrating for anybody. They're telling the creator of his own show, no, this isn't good enough. It's not lofty enough. It's not motion picture worthy. It should be bigger. The destruction of the universe isn't big enough. It was really a tough road for him.
You read the story eventually about Harlan Ellison even being called in to do his pitch.
Harlan pitches a story about this reptilian creatures and the past being manipulated and the Enterprise having to go back and change time and save the planet. The executive at the time said, can this be tied into Aztec mythology?
How about Mayans? Can you work Mayans into it?
And Harlan is like, well, the era I'm talking about, there is no Aztecs. This happens much later. Apparently the guy had just read Chariot of the Gods, which was huge in the 70s, and wanted to include what was very then in the zeitgeist. Harlan, as is his wont, basically freaked out on the guy and was done. And that was the end of Harlan and that project. They also went to Robert Silverberg, who had a take. Silverberg pitched them something which was based on one of his novels, actually, Across the Billion Years. That didn't happen. They were having a really difficult time. So Gene Roddenberry's developed this treatment. People read in Starlog, the thing where they think it's about Spock going and killing Kennedy. That's not really what the script was about. It's crazier than that. The Enterprise arrives in the Sol system, Earth, and finds all these bodies drifting in space. Some are in spacesuits, others are naked. It's really weird. Something has happened in the past that has affected Earth. They beam down to the planet and are attacked by these fearsome creatures. Sarek sacrifices himself to save everyone. Amanda is brutally raped by the Klingons. This is true. I'm not making this is horrible. Klingons have gone back in time to the Guardian Forever and changed the past. The Enterprise goes, they find out from the Guardian what's happened. They take the Enterprise back in time, mid-1960s, but the Enterprise crashes in northern Canada. It's mistaken as UFO. So Kennedy does not go to Dallas because he's dealing with the UFO crisis in Canada. And in one of the great scenes, Kirk and Kennedy meet. And one of my favorite things about the treatment is Kirk doesn't like Kennedy. He feels he's very arrogant. And he basically tells him, look, the timeline's been altered. You were supposed to be killed in Dallas and all this other stuff. And they end up working together begrudgingly. Meanwhile, there's also a Klingon that's been captured by the FBI that's feeding them misinformation, but they want him because they think he can give them futuristic technology. It's wild. You got to admire the chutzpah of it. There was no way Paramount was making this movie. There are actually subsequent iterations, which are where the rumors come from, where, yes, Spock is on the grassy knoll and has to kill Kennedy. But that was never seriously being considered by Paramount. But it was something that Gene was pushing very hard, and he would continually try and resurrect.
You're sitting at home feeling powerless, except that you do have a fandom base. Still, things are expanding, things are evolving.
It was about that time that David Picker, who ran the studio, who was a big fan of Phil Kaufman, and the movie White Dawn that he had done for the studio, which was not a successful movie, but it was critically acclaimed, and everyone at Paramount really liked Phil Kaufman, approached him about doing Star Trek. They involved some really great people, including Ken Adam, who had been the production designer of most of the great Bond movies, Ralph McQuarrie, who had just finished Star Wars. Phil Kaufman is a big science fiction fan, but admittedly not a huge Star Trek fan. They married him to two writers, Chris Bryant and Alan Scott. They had just done a huge movie, Don't Look Now, with Donald Sutherland on Julie Christie, which had been a huge hit. And they came up with a concept called Planet of the Titans. The thing about Planet of the Titans was it was Phil Kaufman's idea to do a much more adult Star Trek movie. He also was a big fan of the Spock character and Leonard Nimoy. And to a certain extent, Kirk would have been sidelined. There were even rumblings that Shatner wasn't necessarily interested in doing the movie, and that Paramount wanted somebody like Robert Redford to play, Kirk. The absolute coolest thing was who Phil Kaufman wanted to play the villain. He wanted, this would have been the greatest Star Trek villain of all time, better than even Khan, Toshiro Mifune as a Klingon. He would have been, Toshiro Mifune, of course, was the star of all these great Kurosawa movies, Rashomon and the Seven Samurai and Yojimbo, and he wanted him to play a Klingon. And to have the ultimate samurai play the ultimate Klingon warrior, if I've one regret of one thing we never got to see in the history of Star Trek, it's Toshiro Mifune playing a Klingon. Now, in Planet of the Titans, Captain Kirk has disappeared, and they go to this planet Cygna, where they're trying to find Captain Kirk. Long story short, the Enterprise is thrust back in time through a black hole and back to the dawn of Earth. And we find out that the Enterprise crew were actually the people that gave humanity fire and are the Titans of myth. It was very cerebral. Kaufman wanted to do a very heady mind trip kind of film. They were already scouting. They were shooting in England. It got to the point where Bryant and Scott were off the project, and Kaufman was revamping the treatment and was trying to get it ready. And he'd pulled this crazy all-nighter where he finally felt he had licked the story problems, that he had a story that was absolutely going to work, that was going to be brilliant. And he got the call, the movie's canceled, we're going to do it as a TV series. Paramount had said to Phil Kaufman at the time, there's no future in science fiction, which is a great quote. There's no future in science fiction, we're canceling the project. And of course there was a future, because Star Wars would open, this is about 3 weeks after the movie was canceled, and proved to be the #1 film of all time at the time, proving there was a future in science fiction. But at that time, they had chosen to once again send Star Trek back to television.
We subscribed to TV Guide. There was a one page called Hollywood Teletype. I remember getting it and falling off my chair. This is July 1977. Paramount to launch 4th Network, Star Trek to be the flagship. Gene Roddenberry in command.
This was an exciting time because Gene finally got what he wanted. Then television pre-production began. They were building sets. They needed a new updated Enterprise, and they got Matt Jeffries back. They signed William Shatner back to be Captain Kirk. Leonard Nimoy didn't want to come back.
There was a ticking clock, and they needed to get the show going.
Roddenberry requested story ideas from at least a dozen different writers, and I was asked to submit story ideas for television shows. So when I was talking to Roddenberry at Paramount, he said, I've got something for you. And he handed me this piece of notes called Robots Return. It wasn't even a Star Trek story. It was a science fiction concept about big machine goes out, comes back to Earth looking for its maker. He said, while you're doing your own stuff, see if you can make something out of this. So that was one of the 3 ideas I submitted, was an expansion of that. The series was a go, but they wanted to open the series with a 2-hour movie for TV. In Thy Image, which was the way I retitled it, was selected to be the opening episode, was going to be 2 hours long, was given to me, said, can you expand your treatment to carry 2 hours instead of 1 hour? Which I then did. And Roddenberry put his arm around me and said, you know, you remind me of me when I was your age. And he said, you're going to be the story editor when the show comes back on the air. So that was nice. Of course, it never happened. If I had any trouble with him at all, it was because he just kept throwing out suggestions for changes. And it got to the point on some of the stuff where I was like, if you think I'm good enough to write this stuff, then you ought to let me write it. And if you want to write it, then you go ahead and write it, and that's fine too. Because if you're going to change every idea, there's no point in doing it.
They started to develop the story. First thing they need is a head writer, showrunner, that will work with Roddenberry to develop the scripts. So the guy they bring in, the guy who just done a series called Future Cop with Ernest Borgnine, Harold Livingston.
I had never seen a Star Trek episode, ever. So they asked me to come over and meet Roddenberry one day. In the beginning, we hit it off rather well. We had similar wartime backgrounds. We were both in the Air Force. Also, we had worked for commercial airlines. They asked me if I were interested in producing this new Star Trek Phase 2.
Livingston was not a fan of Star Trek, and he made that very clear. Roddenberry basically wanted somebody to do what he wanted, and Livingston was not that guy. Livingston is very opinionated.
And I was always challenging him, and I would say to myself, why am I doing this? I wouldn't put up with his interference.
It's a joint effort. It's often done by committee, and I don't think Gene always appreciated the committee. Star Trek was his vision, and he also felt it wasn't broke, and he didn't need anybody to fix it. I heard him say that many times. I was sometimes in his office and he would be on the phone and he was screaming and he was mad, and probably with great justification.
And I could understand Roddenberry's position. This was his creation. And he didn't want it taken from him. Simple as that. And perhaps it shouldn't have been.
Harold Livingston would write it, Gene Roddenberry would rewrite it, and this went on for a while. Finally, the powers that be read both versions.
A couple of days later, Eisner calls a meeting. And we're all sitting there around in this Eisner's office, and Eisner has these two scripts in his hands. And he says, the orange one and the brown one, I don't remember. He says, the orange one, he says, this is Gene's script. He said, Gene sitting there beaming, he said, good script. It's a television script. And he said, this is Harold's script. It's a movie script. Now what do we do?
Paramount had realized that there wasn't advertising support for their fourth network. Paramount television service was not going to go forward. What are they going to do with Star Trek? Well, that's where Michael Eisner, who was at Paramount at the time, looked at the 2-hour pilot in the image and he said, this can be the Star Trek movie.
So the plan was now to take In Thy Image and do it as a low-budget Star Trek movie, but because they were already building sets and production had gone and there'd been so many stops and starts, they decided to continue the fiction that this was being developed as a TV series, but it was actually being developed as a low-budget movie.
They had to go back to the beginning with signing the actors and
there were
getting a new model.
negotiations to pull that cast in, and that would take some time. And in the meantime, the production for Phase 2 just kept rolling along.
Because it was
and
less expensive
and they couldn't
to keep
tell
buying
them
scripts.
while they were in the midst of the negotiations.
So
it was just rolling on. Great material for future books, but it was never going to go to the screen. And so by the time the movie came along, it was carrying $10 million worth of baggage.
There's so much that went on in that 10 years, and so many unsung heroes in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and it's funny because nothing like this phenomena could or will ever happen again. The way that mass media is set up to consume and to exploit IP, something like Star Trek would never lie dormant for that long. There wouldn't be a natural fan rediscovery. We live in a very accelerated culture, and I don't see something like Star Trek ever slowly being able to develop. It wasn't a studio attempting to exploit it. It came from a very natural place. It came from the fans who discovered this and rediscovered it and built it, and then the studio took notice of what this was. And it really is a remarkable piece of popular culture, something that we could be talking about again in another 50 years.